You're right, but we may need to flush it out. What kind of activists? Who gave me that? John? What do you mean? Let me ask the question.
Special interest groups.
All right, we're on the same track. Let me ask, it's a lousy question. It's too broad. Let me ask a better question. Who might be the people in this community that are living there? I talked about the ethnic groups, I talked about the racial groups, and I talked about the economic groups. Okay? How would you characterize the economic groups? What label would you give them?
There'll be some yuppies. There's always that.
The yuppies, the gentrifiers, right?
Yeah.
The people who are buying those $350,000 townhomes as single-family dwellings. Okay? Conversely, who else might be represented in this group?
People have been there for a long time.
All right? And what might be happening to those people as the yuppies and gentrifiers are coming in? They're getting displaced, right? Okay? All right? To the extent that we might have a special interest group, we'll come back to your point, John, all right? Because these guys have helped me ask better questions. To the extent that we might have a special interest group, which of these two might be represented, quote unquote, by a special interest group? All right, so then that's what I thought you had in mind when you said the term activist, but I wanted to flesh it out some more. Okay, so the affordable income housing activist type groups. Okay.
For the homeless.
Coalitions, right? Okay. So let me just put the term reps. Okay. So we got two people here. How many might we have here?
12, 15.
Oops. Okay. What we're going to explore now is trying to mediate in this type of setting. Okay?
The alderman might also be.
Oh, hey. I like that. Pauls.
What about like the general?
Ah, where do we put the politician? That's an interesting point.
Well, if we're talking about U of I, they're probably over on the other side.
Can we do this, perhaps? Is that a possibility?
That's
Might
real.
that person be, quote-unquote, straddling the fence? I think one could argue that that's what politicians do for a living. Okay? So we're not quite sure where we put the politician, but he or she is a person with an interest in this matter. Okay? So, you're mediating this. First question is, how, if at all, is the mediation the same as it would be if you had only a builder and a homeowner? How is the mediation the same in terms of the things that you will be doing and the techniques you will be using?
Finding out needs and interests.
Okay? Anything else? Same process. You're right. Okay? Anything else?
Same goal, I guess.
I don't agree with that.
Why not?
I don't agree with having the same goal.
Why not?
I think there's a power differentiation there, so I think the goals are different.
What did you have in mind when you said the goal would be the same?
I guess I was thinking that you're still giving people a forum to be able to talk to one another and to present their side of the story and have somebody neutral listen to it. So no matter if you've got 2 people there or you've got 400 people there, people are still getting their opportunity to have their day in the sun.
Agree or disagree?
I disagree.
Okay. Go ahead. How, why?
Because you're taking my house away from me.
In terms of these people.
Right.
Okay?
You're taking my house, and you've got the money to do that, and I don't have very much power in holding on to that.
Okay. Well, go ahead.
Are you asking in terms of the mediator, or in terms of what's going to be the same as far as the mediator, or as far as the people involved?
Okay.
As a mediator, I would think that hopefully the process would remain the same, and your goal as a mediator would be to help them possibly resolve a conflict. as a goal of two different people, they may have slightly different needs or interests, but I would hope that it would remain the same or consistent.
Well, you guys are going to load this videotape with all this dead sound, right? Identifying different needs and interests? Is that where you're at, Tim?
I would say for the two different community and the builder, there's probably different needs and interests. For the mediator, I would think that his goal might be the same, help them, as she said, give them some sort of forum to speak about it.
What do you think? I'm sorry, your name is?
Marianne.
Marianne, what do you think, Marianne? You buy
Yeah,
that?
I agree with that.
So Tim just mediated between Marianne and
Carol.
Carol?
Sorry.
All right? And that's fine, because that's exactly one of the things I wanted to talk about, all right? What you have here is you do not simply have a bilateral mediation or discussion going on. You have a multilateral mediation and or discussion going on, okay? Your process is the same. You're still going to identify needs and interests, okay? You're still going to give an opening statement, have an initial statement, identify the issues, crosstalk. One thing we didn't have up here is, to some extent, we'll just explore this, your techniques will be the same. You're going to bat down, you're going to whack down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? The critical distinction, however, or at least one of, at least two, in my view, is it's not just the needs of interest of the builder and the needs and interests of the other side, the disputant, okay? In this case, in the other hypothetical, the uppie. You've got needs and interests going on here. You've got a set of negotiations and mediation going on here, as well as here, okay? And the degree to which you manage not only this negotiation, but this negotiation is a big difference when you have multiple, and not multiple parties, because we only have two parties here. We have the community and the builder, okay? We got multiple components of a party, in, well, sometimes in both cases, but in this particular one, only one case. And that's one of the two big distinctions, and that's one of the things you have to be aware of, that you've got a multilateral negotiation going on, okay? And that's going to dictate, to some extent, how you handle what it is that you do, all right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you might do or might not do under those circumstances, okay? How about your discussions in caucus, for example, with this group? Given the fact that it's multilateral, all right, are you doing this very same thing? You're identifying these needs and interests with the organizations and the church, and the organizations and the block club, and the organizations and the uppies, and the organizations and the displacement, and then the church on each of those, okay? So not only is it multilateral, it's almost like a spider's web, if you will. No pun intended, because I'm going to the spider conference next week. But it's almost like a spider web, if you will. And there's all these little pieces that sometimes interlock and sometimes are quite disparate and incapable of interlocking, okay? This is, not only might this scenario sound familiar to you, this is a fairly good description of my neighborhood, all right? And the displacement here, not the displacement, but the degree to which those two groups can interlock is not very strong, quite frankly, okay? Some people have characterized it as socioeconomic warfare, all right?
We forgot businesses, which are really important.
Sure?
I see them on both sides.
Yes.
Sure. Okay? And depending on the business, too. Is Starbucks needs and interests going to be different than the little corner grocery store?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right? So what you did, really the key critical element going in, first of all, is to be aware of this multilateral negotiation within this group, as well as a negotiation between these two disputants. Okay? Number one, you have to be aware of that. Because it affects what you're doing. Because also in a situation like this, who's the leader? There may not be one. Okay? Is the leader necessarily appointed? Like the attorney?
They
Okay.
vow. They merge.
Right. There's an evolution going on. There's a metamorphosis going on. And many times, when you're sitting at the table, and this is going to happen more in caucus than anywhere, but it can happen even in joint session, what I end up doing is somebody speaking. may be the leader, it may not, okay? Let's say Helen here is speaking, all right? And as Helen's speaking, I'm scanning the room, watching the rest of the people at the table. And I'm looking at this. Who's nodding their head yes? Who's shaking their head no? Who's got a quizzical look on their face? Okay? Particularly if we don't have a, quote, leader, close quote, all right? Now, if Tim is shaking his head no, as Helen's making a statement, do I confront Tim with the fact that, Tim, I notice you're shaking your head no, what's wrong? Okay? Do I use the fact that he was shaking his head no, however? All right? Now, how do you do it? Okay? Now, I don't know why he's shaking his head no. I mean, I might be able to guess if he's one of the yuppies with the polo shirt and Helen's one of the noted low-income housing activists. Okay, I might be able to make an inference. All right? But the safest thing, of course, I'm inclined to say is, well, gosh, what do you guys think of what it is that Helen's just said? All right? And Tim may be compelled to go ahead and raise it. All right? So you're watching the body language, you're watching the conduct. Sometimes he may be quite overt and just come up and say it, okay, that he disagrees and the reason why, okay. So I'm cognizant of what's going on because, again, that body language is representative of this multifaceted negotiation. And that's the thing that you need, in my opinion at least, to be most aware of when you have multiple parties, either on both sides or one side. What happens basically, and this is really, and Andy kind of touched on this, I don't know if you used the term because I was in and out of the room, but it also can happen here. Because you have a negotiation going on within this group, within the negotiation and the mediation, you also will have mediators within this group. And some of these people may emerge would probably be the operative term. He may emerge as an operator, maybe because of their position. Maybe the parish priest is there. Okay? And that person may emerge as the mediator within this group. Okay? Andy talked earlier about using your attorney. Well, one way to use your attorney is as a mediator between you and the disputant, especially when you're doing things like reality testing and batting on, wetting on, that kind of stuff. All right? Here you might have a mediator or mediators, quite frankly, since you have multiple parties, that might emerge. And you have to be aware of who they might be. And probably you only have two things to go on. Either their position relative to the dispute, like the priest, okay, or their conduct within the context of the discussion in the caucus. Sometimes you just get lucky. Sometimes one of these people is a real obstacle. All right? It's happened to me. And sometimes you get lucky. The obstacle has to leave. All right? But you also have to identify who's the obstacle and why that person is the obstacle. Okay? Is that person an obstacle only because he or she is obnoxious, or is that person an obstacle and in a position to influence the rest of the group as you're trying to forge some kind of settlement on a bilateral level? Unfortunately, I'm going to raise more questions for you than answers, quite admittedly. Okay? But the best I can tell you right now, at least up to this point, is to be aware of the fact that you've got different needs and interests within the group, and be aware of the body language and the behavior and the conduct of people within the group. Yes, Linda?
Linda, thank
Okay.
you, Rick. Would that be then a strategy for a mediator to try to move this from the multilateral to the bilateral by reaching consensus within this community group first, and then you can bring them back together with the builder? Okay.
Yeah, ultimately. I mean, you're going to approach this, particularly in the early stages of the mediation, as a traditional bilateral mediation. Okay? Number one, because it's set up in that fashion, community versus builder. Okay? And number two, because early on in the mediation, you're aware of the fact that you may have this phenomena going, but you're not certain. It is conceivable, I don't think it's likely, but it is conceivable that all these parties may be on the same page given this dispute vis-a-vis the builder. All right? It's conceptually conceivable, let's put it that way.
Highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely, yes. Would you be safe in assuming that that's not true? Yes. Should you begin the mediation assuming that it's not true? No. All right? Because you just don't know. All right? So you'll begin early on in the traditional, well, I don't know if I want to use that word, but in the bilateral mode. How's that? Okay? And then as the mediation goes on, and particularly as you get into caucus, you begin to see the degree to which these different needs and interests emerge. And what you end up doing, more or less in effect, is you have a mediation here, in order to mediate here. And sometimes you can get over the stuff and sometimes you can't. Sometimes they're irreconcilable. Okay? The Starbucks versus the corner grocery store. The uppies who want the $350,000 home versus the hardworking lower middle class family who wants to pay $300 a month in rent. Okay? Sometimes you have ideology in terms of the reps. Okay? Without making any comment about whether they're right and wrong, those people are highly ideological, very, very committed. Okay? And you know, I've often joked I can mediate money, but it's very hard to mediate principle. All right? So sometimes they may be irreconcilable, but you do start bilateral, move towards the multilateral in order to come back to the bilateral. Now that's a little harder to do with the same amorphous organization. It'll be easier when I talk a little bit about unions, which is where I usually see this context. Yes,
What
Marianne?
do you do about people that are on that one side? and
This side?
You know, yeah. You know that they're not going to move because they really belong on the other side.
I think I know what you mean, but give me an example.
Well, like, let's say a business that is not just a mom and pop grocery store, but it's a halfway decent one, but they want more economic development in their neighborhood. So that they can get, you know, they can make their store bigger or they can add to it, and they see that as,
Okay?
and they're going to hold up this other element.
Okay? Or perhaps the politician who knows that if these homes are built and these people come in, who's more likely to add to his or her coffers? This person, these people, and this person, or these? Okay? Well, that's why I got them here. All right? So what do you do if they're in the wrong, quote-unquote, place?
Yeah, if you know that they're not going to move, you're not going to come to some kind of a, will they automatically just kind of go over to that other side, or are they constantly thwarting that process within your caucus all the time?
I'm more inclined to think that what you'd probably have here is you probably in the first instance would have your, to the extent that they're even represented, okay? Your Starbucks people would be here, all right? Or implicitly here because of the inference we've just made, okay? And your corner grocery store would be actually physically present here or implicitly again because of that inference we've just made, okay? So probably my guess is they'll fall into one of the other camps as opposed to being in the wrong camp and trying to thwart it and undermine it, okay? You know, because the other reason too, if you've got the rep from Starbucks over here, okay, and he or she is acting in such a way to undermine it, all right, ultimately that then comes to their ultimate disadvantage, all right, because how many of these people are going to move in and buy $350,000 townhomes if there's vandalism? Okay, those homes have been struck with, you know, yuppie, go home or something, or stuff like that. All right. You could also conceivably, I think, since this is a corporate entity, or not corporate, a business entity, you could conceivably also just talk to these people separately.
How
Have a sidebar, so to speak.
how would eminent domain enter into this?
I mean, where does the city fall in this lineup?
Yeah,
Yikes. Probably
politics.
there. I think you'd probably handle them the same way. Although it depends if you've got a bureaucrat versus an elected official. You might have another complicated mess there because the bureaucrat technically is there to enforce and interpret the law, okay? But what other purpose does the bureaucrat serve, particularly in this setting? Bring in the business, bring in the property values, bring in the enticement to say that the city is rebuilding again, come back to the city, come back from Schaumburg and Oak Lawn back to the city, okay? And who benefits by that? The bureaucrat in the building department? Or the mayor or village manager or whatever it is. So my guess is the city probably falls into that same overlapping category. You might have to do the same thing with that city rep or that politician, which you might have to do in the Starbucks situation. Let's see. All right, so we talked about probably the two biggest things, at least in my experience here, are identifying the needs and interests, the body language. All right. How about emotion? Does emotion play any different role in this kind of setting?
What do you mean different?
Well, let me ask a question. Let me ask it differently. What would be the impact of emotion, whatever it might be, whether it's anger, okay, or it's, I'm overstating the case purposely to make the point, greed, Okay? Is the impact of emotion any different in a setup like this than it might be in a one-on-one builder-owner?
You just have
Just
more of it.
more of it.
More of it. Not necessarily different, but more. Okay?
And it could be different. Some could be just angry, and others could be very frightened, and others could be bitter, and you get the whole gamut depending on where they're coming from.
Okay? So we might have, I think we're definitely agreed that at least the prospect for the greater release of emotion, whatever it might be, greed or anger or whatever, is greater. If for no other reason that you got a groupthink going on. Okay? And people tend to get, your courage gets built up. You might tend to speak up more than you would if it was one-on-one. Okay? Or you might be sitting there saying, there's 5 people who agree with me, and the other 2 who are in a quote-unquote minority are more reactive or willing to speak up to defend themselves. Okay? So it would seem to me in a case like this, the role of emotions might very well be different, either because it's stronger or different in kind than it would be in a one-on-one, pure bilateral dispute. What do you do then as the mediator with this possibility? Do you try to diffuse it?
You hear it out.
You try to just let it vent and hopefully it vents and dissipates? Or do you actually try to use it? You try to use the anger and the greed to reach settlement within the group as well as settlement between, okay? My own personal view is, and in my own personal experience, is I think I tend to use the emotion more in these settings as a means of getting settlement. Not early on, okay? I mean, I usually try to reserve that for later in the mediation, but I'm assessing as we go along, and I might actually, in some cases, I've actually orchestrated in the mediation an emotional, angry, volatile dialogue in the hopes of breaking a logjam. And I'll give you that example in a couple minutes. So I think your initial desire to either diffuse it or let it vent and dissipate has a slightly different dimension, and you might want to also include to that potential strategies with emotion the possibility for using the emotion to actually cause settlement and break impasse. 2 examples. Most of my work is in labor management cases, and in one case it was a bilateral situation, in one case it was not, so I'll get them both to you. The case that was purely bilateral, employer and plaintiff, was a disability discrimination case. And we started the mediation in August, and after about 4 hours, the parties were about $100,000 apart. There had been minimal movement, they were about $100,000 apart. Being the sort of stubborn, obnoxious, perseverant soul that I am, I concluded the mediation but continued to bug them with phone calls over the next 4 or 5 months. And in effect, mediation continued via telephone. Okay? And we got into around February, and the parties were $5,000 apart. And both said, no, we will not budge. And I tried everything. I tried all the reality testing in the BATNA and the WATNA, and I even tried Bradley's old trick about the mediator makes a suggestion and does it in, okay, tried that. Nobody wanted any part of anything, all right? And I finally decided, well, I am not going to terminate this mediation over telephone. I'm going to terminate it in person. I am going to force the 2 of you in person, sit across from one another, and say to each other, $5,000 keeps us apart. And I brought it back in, and I made them do that, and they both said it, and then they continued to talk, and we got the settlement. Now, that wasn't so much anger or greed or anything, but I wanted that face-to-face statement to one another, $5,000 is keeping us apart. It was too easy to hear it come from me. Oh, the plaintiff says no, okay, fine. Oh, the defendant says no, okay, fine. I wanted them to do it face-to-face. I wanted them to look each other in the eye and say, we've come this far, and $5,000 holds us apart. In a multilateral setting, more particular to our given topic, most of my labor mediation is done in teacher negotiations. And first of all, is anybody here a K-12 teacher? I have a loved one who's a K-12 teacher.
Have been.
Well, they tend to be, how can I say this politely? They tend to vigorously represent their interests. Okay? How's that? Maybe more so than other litigants. And we were in contract negotiations for a union contract, and it's much like this. I started with this analogy so I wouldn't give you a labor management setting, okay? It's exactly like this. So in this particular case, and this was very typical, there was the school board president and the superintendent, and then the school board, which I think in central Indiana consists of 5 people, okay? And over here was the outside union rep, not the elected union rep, the person who works for the union, right? The elected union president, the bargaining team, which was about 12 people, and then 35 teachers. Okay? And we had been in mediation for about several months at this point. And at this point, I was mediating with just the chief spokesperson, the school board president, the superintendent, the outside union rep, and the elected union president. Everybody else was in the building, but they were in separate rooms and separate corners. Okay? And the 5 of us were in the mediation session. And we had been at it at this point, this was like our 4th session, and we were probably in about the 10th or 11th hour of the 4th session, so it was probably about 1 o'clock in the morning at this point. And we were very, very close to a settlement. And at one point, the school board president made a statement, and the union rep got up and he crashed his chair to the floor, and he walked up to the guy and he said, "You don't respect us, you don't care about us, you don't treat us like human beings, we're the people that teach these kids," yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera, okay? And then he goes further and he says, "And you know what? I think when you leave this room where the 5 of us are and you go back to your team, I think that you are lying to your team and you're misrepresenting what's going on in the room." So the school board president gets up, throws the chair to the floor, denies everything, of course, and says, "If you think that's what's happening, then you come in and meet with my team and you tell them what's going on in this room." And the union rep goes, "Okay."
Yeah.
All right? And then the school board president says, "In fact, bring your team with you." Now, at this point, one might be inclined to diffuse the anger, hope that it dissipates, call a timeout. I wanted the exact opposite. Okay? So that everybody retreated to their respective corners. Okay? And the school board president came out to me and he said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure. How many people are down the hall?" I said, "Oh, there's about 35 of them." He goes, "Well, you know, I've only got 7. I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, what are you going to do in this meeting?" "I'm going to sit in the corner and keep my mouth shut." He goes, "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" I said, "You called the meeting. You requested it. I'm going to keep my mouth shut." So we brought him in. So at this point, we had about 45 people in the room. And it was probably from this wall to the table and about here. Okay? By this point, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And they screamed and yelled at each other for the next 30 minutes. And I sat in the corner and kept my mouth shut. Half an hour later, it settled. Okay? So that was a case where, and it happened to be a multilateral setting, but I think you could use it even in a bilateral setting, okay? I wanted to use that anger and emotion, which fed because there were multiple people in the room. One person would say something, somebody else would jump up and underscore it, okay? I wanted that type of release, if you will, in the hopes that then people would separate to their respective corners and say, "My God, we got to do something." And that's exactly what happened. Other things that might be unique to the union setting, you do have a leader. You have the outside union rep, the person who works for the union. And you clearly have the elected union president, okay? That adds a slightly different role, okay? Because now you've got a political dimension within your multilateral group, right? This person, or one of these 2 people, is actually running for office. And what is the union president going to campaign on? What I got in the last contract, or what I will get in the next contract, how well I represent you, okay? So you've got, here I put the poll on both sides, on all sides, straddling the whole issue. Here you have that political, democratic manifestation within the group as well. And that's an added element that you have in union negotiations. You also have the elected, not the elected, the appointed, the hired union rep. The hired gun, if you will, the alleged expert, okay? And it's not uncommon in mediating these kinds of cases where you actually meet with that person, okay, outside the presence of the rest of his or her team. Commonly called a sidebar or shadow negotiations sometimes. And many times you'll have very candid conversations that are off the record with that person. They'll tell you, "I can't do this, I can't do that, I have to have this, I have to have that," okay? The information that he can't share with you in the presence of his or her team, but might very well impact negotiations that's going on. And sometimes you'll have negotiations with just the chief spokespersons of the two teams, the hired union rep or the school board president or the attorney, as the case may be. So that's another facet of this multilateral phenomenon that's going on that differs because of the presence of a known and appointed leader, particularly the one who is the elected party. If you do those kinds of sidebars and things like that, you got to be concerned, because what's the rest of the team thinking when you're out in the hall with their person? Or what's the fear? What should I, as a mediator,
Selling them out.
Selling them out, precisely. Cutting the deal. Okay? And even if they're not thinking that, you can't take 35 minutes in those conversations. They've got to be 5-minute conversations. They've got to be quick, dirty, right to the point. Because even if they're not being thought that they're being sold out, they're at least being excluded, okay, which is a subset of being sold out. Right? And you want to avoid that because that creates another obstacle within that multilateral phenomenon that's going on. Well, that was all I was prepared to actually talk about. Any other questions or comments? I know I've got another subject on my agenda, but if you get any questions or comments about this before I move on. Yeah, Rebecca.
When you had both groups meet and there was all this emotion, what do you think caused the movement then? You know, what was the watershed that caused them?
Oh, that caused them to move after the big blow?
Like what was the mechanism you thought worked? Like, why did that work?
I think it was a combination of things. I'm not sure what percentage, but I think it was, to some extent, I think it was sheer fatigue. It was already 2 o'clock in the morning at that point. It was also the timing. By that point, it was around February of the school year. The school year was half over, and we hadn't gotten the contract yet. Okay. I think some of the things that people said to one another struck responsive chords. I think it was one thing for the school board to hear the union rep say, "You don't respect us." Oh, he's just a guy from Indianapolis. He's the hired gun. And this was a little small farm community in central Indiana. I think it was another thing to hear the teachers say that. Okay. And also, I think what happened is, and this is the downside to breaking into sidebars. Remember I said I was negotiating with the 5? Okay. Everybody got a chance to say something. Everybody got a chance to be heard. And everybody heard those who spoke. And so it was kind of that exclusionary type. We got around that as well. I think it was a combination of all those things. And of course, I fed those things. I mean, after the meeting broke up, and I did go and meet with each side separately, you know, I would just say things like, "Wow, you know, how are you guys feeling right now?" Okay? Well, I'm glad I got that off my chest. Or, "Gee, I never knew they felt that way." Okay? I think that's what happened. And in this multilateral setting, we just did it in sort of a Big Bang theory. I mean, that's those kinds of things you do as you mediate anyway. Okay? But we saved it for the Big Bang, for the ultimate climax, if you will. And sometimes it's orchestration. Yes, Marion. Oh, Marion and John.
What do you do when in this kind of a situation, the builder keeps building?
Yeah.
Because you got to get to the terms of agreement quickly, or that's going to continue. So
Right.
Are there any kind of like inner like, hey, cut it out for a while, or?
Well, that's a potential solution, and that you know, it's not one that I as a mediator would necessarily float, but it's just another element of trying to figure out what those needs and interests are. Okay, that might satisfy the need and interest of these people, for example. Okay, because they're not continuing to be displaced. All right, but that's certainly not going to meet the need and interest of the builder to make a profit. Okay. So probably what you'd do is if that came out onto the table, you'd be searching for something, either a variant on that or something else that meets this person's needs and interests as well. But you know, you can have cooling off periods, so to speak. Okay, it happens a lot in labor. You know, the strike vote is set for Friday, and you're mediating under the terms of the strike vote. The trick there is the degree to which the parties, more so than the mediator, want that pressure point to compel movement. Because what you're doing when you go for cooling off periods is you're asking the parties to relieve on that. And sometimes that's the thing that's costing movement. So that's a decision you need to make given the context. John, you're...
Yeah, in the case of the school board, I could see the emergent leaders being there, but with the 35 teachers, it seems as though that's intimidation.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. You mean intimidating the school board?
Yeah.
Sure. I agree. Was I worried about it? Nope. In fact, it was part of the orchestration. And that's why when the school board president came out and was concerned about that very precise thing, that's why I told him, you called the meeting. You asked for it.
We have a similar case going now where a black preacher has a case filed against the school board for not hiring enough minority teachers. And the case is ongoing. So every time the school board meets, this preacher has all his congregation say, just sure can look black.
Sure.
And it really causes
Absolutely. And
movement.
in fact, it's been too many years since I've read it, but if I remember correctly, if you read any of Saul Leminski's work, that's one of the things that he advocated was just the mere presence and numbers of the community being part of this and demonstrating to the other side what is at stake. Sometimes you need, it's one thing for a mediator to ask a party to talk about it and to self-identify, okay? It just kind of gets back to, I don't know what was Rebecca's point, but I mean, that's what we try to do as we work our way through this. That's what BATNA is, that's what reality testing is, okay? But sometimes there's no substitute for a very graphic, overt demonstration of that. Now, I'm not advocating that you make that your regular arsenal of strategies as a mediator, okay? And that's why I didn't do anything like this until it was the 4th mediation session at 2 o'clock in the morning in February when the school year had half been over. I wouldn't have done that in the first meeting, okay? But the degree to which we are closer to impasse, or the degree to which we are closer to a critical point in time, the strike vote or the beginning of school or whatever the case may be, that's the degree to which I'm more willing to consider using strategies that I wouldn't have used in other settings. If you trot those out too early, they're counterproductive, basically, too. Linda, do you have your hand up? I thought I saw a hand.
Well, I just had a thought, and that is our whole goal is to try to mitigate power differences, and that is a way to do it. You know, if one group has more numbers and the other one has the money, you know, the authority, it certainly is a way to bring them more on an even plane.
Yeah, I think it's probably in this setting, it's actually a way to demonstrate that there might not be as much power imbalance as one might think when they first look at it, because this guy's got all the money. Okay, well, these people have a significant amount of influence as well. And it might not be apparent until you get them in that room with 35 people on one side and 2 people on the other. Again, I'm not suggesting that you make this part of your regular arsenal. It's the type of things that I sort of keep in my hip pocket for critical moments. I see the hook coming out.
No, it's not a hook.
Okay.
I haven't used my authority that much. I want to jump in on this question.
I contradicted everything that
Oh, no,
CCR stands
no.
for.
You're not contradicting anything. And I came in at the end, so you can wave me out if I'm wrong. But I heard you say a goal might be to mitigate power imbalances.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I think because that's kind of a theme I've been hearing from the university. I mean, a goal in our mediation, I guess because we haven't specifically talked about power imbalances, but I just want to emphasize this, just because there's more people on one side or whatever, power is dynamic, it's constantly shifting, and I think if you're making that your goal, you're going to be in trouble, and you're going to cut yourself out and actually skew things maybe the wrong way. You may have some more comments on that, but what seems to be a power imbalance may not be. The classic, I mean, when I think about the employment discrimination cases we do, one may ultimately think, well, God, here's, on one side is this attorney, they're head of the human resources, the person who supposedly did the discrimination has been nasty to this person over here, and the ultimate decision maker, and you may have one person sitting over here who feels they've been discriminated against. They don't think there was any discrimination, okay? I have no idea whether there was or wasn't. They are actually, so you might think they have all the power. Actually, let me change it slightly. I actually, sitting in my view, think in terms of quote-unquote legal or unlawful discrimination, there isn't. They may have felt there was, but there wasn't. So even from that standpoint, they have all the power. They have the legal power here. You know what? this person can hold them hostage for 2 or 3 years. I mean, they have power in the fact that they have enough to have a claim there. And that's just one example. I mean, there's so many different levels of power. You have to be very careful of what you're doing as a mediator if you're focused that way. And Michael and I were talking in the background too, so I think Michael may have something to add. Come up if you're okay to do it.
I just want to be
No,
clear.
this is a real important
Yeah,
point, so
sometimes-
that's why I wanted to jump in.
Sometimes there's some confusion, and I think, you know, what Rocky was saying really illustrates the point very well. Look, we are, as mediators, we are not trying to change the structure of the world. In fact, the opposite. We're trying to do the best job we possibly can to bring the real structure of the world into the mediation itself. So if there is someone who is very powerful, really very powerful, then what we want to do is bring that out in the mediation. Yes, this person has a huge amount more power than you do. And therefore, to have people negotiate with each other based on the realities of what the power situation is outside of that mediation room. What we want to avoid in terms of balancing power when we talk about that is really a matter of somebody being intimidated in a way that they can't really negotiate in their own best interest. That's a whole other problem. And that's when we talk about power imbalances to some degree there. We also try and get people to be able to talk on some kind of equal basis within the mediation. That's what the neutral third party does, whether it's a facilitation or a mediation, bringing that kind of I don't know, if it's a judging, it's not really a judging function, but it's some kind of a balancing function. So someone who may not have as much power outside the room as the other person can at least talk on an equal basis, even though they don't have as much power really. So maybe I can give you several examples of that. I mean, I don't want to waste Rocky's time, but it's very important to realize the difference between that the world is structured some way, and it's a way that mediators have no effect on. We want to, when we talk about reality testing, we're trying to help people look, to go through in their own mind about whether or not they are much weaker than the other party, and to look at their BATNA, because if their BATNA is really bad, then what they ought to do is take a lot less at the negotiating table. That's the whole idea of what we do and getting people to negotiate. So they look at their BATNA and they say something like, you know something, I really have a lot of power here compared to the other person. I'm going to demand a lot more in this mediation, or I'm walking out of here and going with my BATNA. And the weaker person is saying the same thing. I really don't have a very good BATNA. I better take whatever I can get here. So I just want to be clear. The bottom line is the realities of the real world and the power differences, we don't change those. In fact, we do everything we can. Like, and Rocky's example, I think, was great, where you just bring a lot of people in to show that you really do have power.
Actually, you know, there's an old jazz song that says your brain is on vacation and your mouth is working overtime. And so the advantage to me shutting up and listening, particularly listening to people like Michael and Brad, I think all of us are saying the same thing, including Linda, okay? I think where we might have gotten a little sidetracked was the use of the term the goal. And what Brad and Michael have done is they've just demonstrated that what Linda has essentially said was this. Not that it's a goal, but that it is a factor or strategy or technique that can be used in the context of that particular mediation that that is quite appropriate for you to use. That might not present itself in a different setting. So I kind of got the feeling we're all saying the same thing. We're just using different words, and better to probably use these kinds of terms and words because it brings us into the context in which we're discussing the matter. Any other questions on multilateral or comments? Multilateral stuff, mediating in a mob, as I call it. John?
I have one final question, and this question is directed toward what's going on in our country now. With mediation being so popular now and growing increasingly, do you see at any point that the situations that are occurring, like the Paul Jones case and the situation with the president, where mediation could or would intervene to have been more effective than the way things are being handled now?
Well,
There's a loaded question for you.
well, I guess it can be answered in a number of ways. Number one, I would guess, I haven't seen the numbers, but I would certainly guess if you look at the frequency with which mediation and ADR generally is being used now versus what it was used 5, 10, 15 years ago, I think the numbers bear out the proposition that that's what's happening. Okay. just go to the bookstores to see all the books on it and all that kind of stuff, all right? With respect to the Paula Jones type situation in particular, God, I hate to show my inherent cynicism, but I guess I will. I'm not real confident when it comes to this element of a dispute, okay? It's almost part of that, it's almost kind of in that principle area that I talked about earlier, okay? I mean, how many of us in January and now in October are saying, gosh, if you had just cut your losses in January, look where you'd be. You wouldn't be impeached, and you probably would have gotten some bad press for 30 days. And, but, you know, at least you wouldn't be facing impeachment. That's the beauty of hindsight. I guess I'm giving out a lousy answer, admittedly, John. Yeah, I think it's going to happen, and I think it is happening, okay, what you just demonstrated. But I think when you start getting into those kinds of cases, I think the ability of people to make enlightened decisions on their own is much reduced. And maybe the argument then is that's the case for mediation even more. Conceptually, I think it is, but I'm not sure you can convince those people. Kind of, one of your things up there, selling labor unions on mediation. And I saw that as I walked in the room, and my first thought was, why is that a problem? If anybody's been mediating the longest in this country, it's labor management, okay? And they've been doing it it's institutionally now. I'm not talking about informally, but we've been mediating since Confucian times, okay? But I mean, institutionally, labor unions have been mediating since the 30s. And I saw that on the chart, and I'm like, well, if there's anybody who should be proselytizing in favor of mediation, it ought to be unions and employers, okay? I presume, Helen, that's yours, I presume you're describing grievances as opposed to contract mediation, okay? My first reaction is, well, why don't you just ask unions and employers why they mediate contract negotiations and ask them if it's all equally applicable in grievances? And the answer is probably, to a large extent, yes, okay? But for some reason, grievance arbitration, things maybe kind of similar to the Clinton-Jones politician type thing, is just become so ingrained and part of the bloodstream that we're almost incapable of thinking of some alternatives. So I mean, by the time I retire, no, that's too soon. If I had children, by the time my children were to retire, I think we might be where you posited, John. I'm not confident in seeing it in my lifetime. I mean, that raises another observation that I made to Brad earlier in the day, that, you know, the stuff that we do as mediators, you know, we're all capable of doing is disputes. There's no magic here. I mean, you know, listen, consider your alternatives, reality tests, what's your batna and your watna. I mean, those are all the things you learned at grammar school, right? One of these days I'm going to go back and read that book, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. I got a suspicion it's a handbook for mediators and a handbook for disputants, okay? But for some reason, when we are disputants, and I know this is true for me as a mediator, I'm the worst disputant in the world. I forget everything that I'm trying to do, okay? Incredibly conflict averse. For some reason, when we are the disputants, we just become incapable of making those assessments. I don't know if it's because of fear, I don't know if it's because of being too close to it, I don't know if it's because our own interests are at stake and we're afraid to tackle them head on. But in terms of everything that's up there on the board, we're all capable of doing as disputants. Am I worried about being put out of work before I retire? No. But boy, put me in the middle of one of these and I forget everything I've trained to do. I don't know, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Linda.
Rocky, this morning, a question came up. Sometimes people want the other side fired. You know, that's a common initial request, you know, get rid of this person.
And like, for example, maybe somebody's been sexually harassed and they want the harasser fired?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Tortured first, then fired.
Okay.
And the question came up, if courts can legally order an employee to be fired, and it was left for you
Oh.
as the expert in that particular area.
Oh, wow. Leaving it for me is okay, but certainly not as the expert. The question is whether, I'm not sure I know the question.
Whether or not, we're talking about BATNAs here,
Right.
essentially. If this case weren't mediated, and if it were to go to court,
Okay.
is it possible for the court to legally order an employer fire an employee?
To legally order the harasser fired as part of the harassee's lawsuit?
Yeah.
Okay. No.
It didn't seem no, but we didn't know for
Now, is it possible that that person might end up getting fired in some other forum
Oh,
or in a
yes.
collateral
Oh,
type
yes.
action? Oh, sure. But no, I am not aware of any single case in which a person who has been harassed has prevailed, okay, they've proven the harassment, and has received as a order or remedy from the court that the harasser be discharged. I've not seen anything like that.
Well, that's a very good point for reality testing for the people who say, I'm not gonna do this, I'm just gonna go to
Right.
court and he'll be out of here.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm conversant with all of the cases that have come down, but I'm not aware of it.
Lay people have a lot of faith in courts without knowing anything about them.
Yeah, that's because they
And-
haven't been there, that's
Well, neither have many of us, so.
Yeah, but just the mere fact that you're able to ask the question like, have you ever been there? Do you know what it's like? Do you know what the chances are, et cetera, et cetera? Just, you know, a lot of what we do is just we're creating doubt.
Yeah.
It's really, that's what reality testing, Batman Watna is to a large extent, just creating doubt. And disputants are also equally capable of making that same question, okay? But for some reason we don't when we're disputants. Either because we're wound up in it, or we're so convinced of the rightness of our cause, or so angry, or whatever. So just the mere fact that you as a mediator are in a position to ask those kinds of questions that they are capable of asking but don't, might very well be enough to move the matter along.
But shouldn't you have some, Go
I
ahead.
was just going to continue with what she said. Go ahead.
But shouldn't you have some idea what the answer is? I mean, as a lawyer, you don't go to court and ask a question that you don't have a reasonable idea what the answer is.
Yeah,
correct?
but I'm not in that role in a mediating.
But I'm saying, even as a mediator, would you raise a question that you don't have a reasonable idea what the answer
Oh,
is?
sure.
You
You guys are
would?
probably cringing in the back of the room. Sure.
Right. Well, I mean, almost every question I
Yeah.
ask, I don't,
Yeah.
because I don't care what the answer is.
Yeah.
My only point, and I would rephrase slightly what Rocky said, it's not, it's, in my mind, I ask questions just to have them think it through, I don't care what the answer is.
Can I just add a little bit to that? I think it can be just as useful to know what information you don't have, or the answers you don't know, is this know the answers. Just knowing you don't know the answers is a bad, for most of us.
And
Yeah,
it's,
definitely.
it's not a bad idea at that point to say, this is something perhaps we need to look into further. And not necessarily in that case, but sometimes you just expose needs for information.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm not sure I would necessarily go
No.
forward and say this is something we want to check out, because sometimes I want to use the doubt and uncertainty. Okay? But yeah, I think Brad stated it very nicely. A whole lot of the questions we ask, we haven't got the slightest idea what the answers are, either in the factual context or the substantive context of wherever we're negotiating, whether it's sexual harassment or... I mean, perfect example is a huge debate in the field as to whether you need substance expertise or process expertise. Can only labor people, employment people, mediate employment cases? Can only environmental people mediate environmental cases? Okay? Substance expertise. Or is it enough to say that you know this process and you know how to ask questions and create doubts and force people to consider alternatives, et cetera, et cetera? Is that enough? Okay? There's a big debate in the field on that point. I personally feel that process expertise is enough. If you have substantive expertise, might you be more efficient? Because you're able to ask more piercing, bad word, but it's getting late, piercing questions, okay? Earlier, okay, because you have that subset of substantive knowledge, sure, okay? But I don't think that necessarily means that a mediator is less effective, not efficient, effective, because he or she doesn't have substance expertise. But that debate, I think, is never going to get resolved, my guess is. Andy?
Rocky, what's your take on the idea that the substantive information biases the mediator? What conserves to do that?
I think the risk is there, okay, because if you don't have that substantive information, you're less susceptible to making conclusions based on that information set, okay? But I think if you're firmly ensconced in what it is that we're supposed to be doing and how we do it, I mean, we're human beings, we're not automatons, we're not robots, okay? You walk into a case and you hear somebody state their case and you make face it, a biased assessment. But you also immediately are able to say, well, and then move on. And I think you do the same thing with substantive expertise. You know, like for example, I was supposed to be on the panel yesterday with Lynn and everybody, and one of the questions was, what do you like least about mediation? And my answer was going to be the whining. Okay? But The minute somebody says something that I believe or feel or strikes me as whining, it's like boom, out, it's out of here. It doesn't affect what I do from that point forward, but I just hate to have it happen, even though it takes 30 seconds. And I think that's kind of along the same lines. I mean, we're human beings. You can't divorce yourself from that, okay? But you can act knowing that you are a human being that is serving as a mediator. You still don't disregard the fact that you're a human being and you have your own emotions and feelings.
Rocky, you want to give us your 5-minute marketing without marketing?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, let me explain the title. I'm a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators, and anybody who is a member or aspires to be a member is absolutely forbidden from doing any solicitation or advertising or marketing. The Academy has the view that if you're going to hire us to dispense justice, we ought not to be outselling justice. Okay? It's kind of the argument for merit selection of judges versus election of judges. So knowing that I once aspired to be a member of the Academy, my marketing consists of printing my letterhead and my business cards and making them available to anyone who asks. Okay? So I don't have brochures, okay? I can't cold call people. I can't go to the courts and look at the docket and say, ooh, this looks like a bunch of good cases. I'll call these parties and see if they're interested in mediating, okay? What do I end up doing then? I end up doing some of the things that I suspect Lynn and Bill and those people talked about yesterday. You give speeches, you write for publication, you not only join organizations, but you become active and identified with organizations. It's not enough to be a member of SPIDER, for example. Run for office and be an officer, serve on a committee, okay? This tape is rolling now, so should I say this? Well, I think I can say it in such a way.
This is easy.
This might be a question more for Brad and for Andy.
Yeah, get
But-
me up.
You mean Rosemary Woods here?
That's right.
But for nonprofit, if it's more of a service, what would be a different avenue where you could market? Let's say, you know, I work for a youth foundation, or if, you know, for John's organization, when you're doing it as a service, I know, is it just getting education, letting people know that it's a service because it's not going to cost anything? What's the best avenue? It's not for fee kind of a thing.
Since I can't and don't market, I'm not in a position to answer the question.
But I actually think you guys could tell me more of it. I think you guys know it, okay? Because you're doing it and you're finding out. So I'm going to start with that because you're in that position where you need to do it, and I'm actually, when I took over here, in a position where I don't have to do it as actively. That being said, I'm going to probably say things you're doing. You have to continually, it's not enough to go once to a judge. And I guess that's a concept of marketing and advertising, period. You have to get your name out in front of people, and the concept of mediation, who you are, over and over and over again in many different ways. We spend a lot of time for our programs with working with the court people, and all it takes is one change in a person, and you have to start all over again. I also think you need to do it both at the top, the middle, and the bottom. They were talking about that yesterday. You know, the administrator may be the key person, and it's politics. When you're talking about the Center for Conflict Resolution programs, you know, different people involved, different judges, it's connections, and it's working that network. So it's a lot of combination of PR and getting to know people and trying to know other people. One good technique is advisory boards, advisory committees. So you can have your own board of your center, and this is good for any program. I think universities usually do that. For example, we got a grant for adult guardianship cases, and we're going to put together an advisory group. So it's going to be people from the community, it'll be some judges, it will be some people that deal with the elderly, social service agencies, mediator types. And you want to, in forming that advisory group, have people who have influence and pull, because that's going to help market the program and get cases. So that might be a nice technique for doing that. I mean, that's, you know, kind of the simple answer. Producer, have Carol,
well,
that was
I have a little bit of background in this.
Right.
Another wonderful place to go, especially for what you two are doing, talk about that, talk about how that service can be bridged between the two areas. And especially local newspapers love kids, that's, you know.
And that's one thing I was going to ask Rocky. If I'm dealing with a bunch of kids and there's two mobs, where can you draw the line of hangers-on who really have nothing to say but want to be a part of it, but really aren't going to add anything to it other than consternation and confusion, and really talking to the people involved in a conflict when you're dealing with youth? I mean, is there kind of a, obviously it's, you know, it's kind of nebulous to say, okay, there's two mobs here, and who are really the
mobs. I
disputants?
thought you said moms.
Oh, no, two mobs.
Okay.
I said moms.
Oh, so
Yeah.
right, so why are you getting rid of the moms?
Two moms, that might be necessary.
No, hypothetically, two mobs.
Okay.
And you've got a bunch of hangers-on.
Okay.
And there's really, you know, there's this group of kids and there's this group of kids, and I'm talking about youth.
And the hangers-on are within the mobs?
Yeah, they want to be a
Okay.
part of the deal, just to be a part of it, but they really, I mean, they're not really adding anything, they're detracting from it, as you said, some of the people who might be detracting from it.
Well, let me respond with two observations. Number
Thanks.
one, I think still some of what we talked about is equally applicable, okay? Number one. And number two, I'm really not going to go beyond that because I don't do the kid thing, either in my real life or the mediator life. I mean, I've been married almost 20 years now. My wife and I decided going in, we didn't want kids. We made a conscious choice. You know, I don't do family, I don't do divorce, I don't do kids, so I can't really speak to your question other than extract from this discussion that which might be equally applicable. That whole mindset and psychology of kids and all the risks and all the dangers and costs, I just worry that I do a worse job and create more problems than I would by going in and trying to solve the problems. And it's just, I hate to duck it, but that's my psyche, I know it, and that's something I stay away from. But I still think if you thought about what we've talked about, you can still extract
You can
from
apply
this.
some of the things.
Yes,
very true.
but what would be unique to that setting, and I suspect there would be some things very unique to that setting, I wouldn't speak to because that's just something that I, as a human being, you know, you talk to me about kids and I break out into a cold sweat. Babies scare me and all that kind of stuff, so I just know that it's something I can deal with.
You want me to turn this off again?
No, that's okay. I'm willing to make that on public. Yes.
Back, we're talking about marketing?
Okay.
Well, are we?
Yes.
Sort of. I wasn't quite sure if we'd gone off different topics, but, because you were talking about your kind of marketing, then went off to this. Well, back to, I know as an arbitrator, you certainly can't do a brochure and advertise, but let's say I would have never arbitrated, wanted to go out and hang up a shingle as a mediator. There's not that same restriction, is there?
No, you're right. In
So
fact,
that
if
I
you
could
are...
market a mediation service for employment rights,
Absolutely.
labor, family, whatever I wanted.
Absolutely.
And that would be acceptable.
Absolutely. And everything that I suspect Lynn and Bill and Jack talked about yesterday would be applicable. In fact, if you wanted to be a labor management arbitrator and mediator and had no aspirations to join the National Academy,
Yeah.
you could advertise all that you want.
Could you advertise your mediation separate from your arbitration, or would that?
Yeah.
Technically you could.
No,
but
no,
like-
technically I can, but it's just too hard to separate it out. And I find one feeds on the other anyway. Some people use it shouldn't, because arbitration and mediation are wildly disparate skills, but some people seem to think if you're a good arbitrator, therefore you're a good mediator, and vice versa, and that's not at all necessarily true. The other thing I should add, because I just had the opportunity to glance at my notes once Brad came up, one thing I did fail to say about marketing when you can't market is, and particularly if you think you're going to be an ADR provider in whatever your substantive area of expertise is, okay, particularly, you begin building your ADR reputation as you serve in those other non-related capacities. By that I mean, number one, you'll deal with the people you may end up dealing with. Okay, for example, in my case, I spent 15 some odd years at state and federal agencies working with unions and employers. And now a lot of my workers are the very same people, okay? So number one, I was already dealing with those people that I would deal with as an arbitrator and mediator. Number two, to the extent that substantive expertise is necessary, you're building it because you're working in that field. And number three, and perhaps most importantly, if you're a real jerk, you ain't gonna get work as an ADR provider. You know, if in your role as something else in this field, if you demonstrate to people that you can't listen, and you won't be open-minded, and you won't be creative and a problem solver and a thinker, those are exactly the traits that they want, for example, in their mediator. And if you demonstrate, as you're a union rep or a labor board rep, that you're rigid and uncompromising and inflexible and won't listen, you're not going to get work as a mediator. because that's exactly what they don't want as a mediator. So you already begin to market, to use that term very, very loosely, you already begin to market yourself in terms of the necessarily inherent skills to do this work when you demonstrate that you have those skills, even though you're acting in a different but related capacity. And I know two people, for example, in this town, both of whom were former union lawyers, who both started arbitration mediation practices, and one of them is wildly successful, and one of them is not. And the one who's wildly successful is a guy who had a reputation as a partisan, as an advocate of being willing to work, being willing to listen, being open-minded, being creative and flexible, and the guy who wasn't is the person who doesn't get any work, because now people perceive him to not have the traits necessary, the traits that they want in their mediator or their arbitrator. So you're already doing that now. There aren't many, maybe by the time, if I had kids, by the time they retire, you'll be able to come out of school and start working as a mediator or an arbitrator, but that doesn't happen now. You start building those skills and that reputation way before you print your letterhead and your business cards and hold yourself out.
Ms. Carroll was saying about the newspaper, the radio. Been there, done that. We have community policing, and we also have police academies in every community. We've given presentations at those meetings. We have access to the police reports every morning, and we go and review and the cases where there have been assault. Sometimes we review those, send letters out. Our main problem is the judge who presides over small claims. The previous judge was all for mediation. I mean, he was the one who got it started, really. But this new judge, he has a deaf ear to it. He won't make any referrals at all. And the public in general, when you mention mediation, it just seems to go over their heads. Like this is something that, you know, that is not for me. I'm not at that level. And that seems to be the problem that we're having. I don't know how to break it down to the public. We've got brochures. We've had articles in the paper. And even with the local radio station, we have them blasting, explaining the entire process of if you are having a neighborhood dispute with your next door neighbor, a plant that you planted in the middle grew up and the leaves are dropping in your yard, you can resolve that. You don't have to stop speaking. Bring it here, we'll help you with it. But it still doesn't know.
Before I defer to Brad, I do actually have something that might be responsive to that. I've discovered, especially in my teaching experience, that the most effective way sometimes to communicate your message is to cast it in terms that your audience understands. So don't talk about mediation. Don't talk about settlement. I mean, even though they should all understand this. Don't talk about resolution, okay? I mean, just say, gee, would you like an opportunity to sit down, you know, informally and talk about what's on your mind and how you're feeling and what might be able to be done about that kind of stuff, okay? Figure out who your audience is and try to speak to them in terms that they will understand, even though you're talking about the very same things. And then after they sit there and say, well, yeah, that would be nice. I'd sure like to sit down and get rid of this and get it out of my hair quickly without a lot of cost and a lot of delay. Well, I got just the thing for you. Okay, but I think if you start the other way, it's kind of like mediation, courts, dockets, police. I don't want to talk about that kind of stuff. Okay, but yeah, I'm real interested in talking about whether I got a problem and how I can get it solved. And that's just my general philosophy to speaking generally, but that might be something, but that's generic. What does go to this man for specificity?
Well, go ahead.
I just want to add one little point to that, and that is, I've listened to a lot of people talk about mediation, what they call it, and be careful with that compromise word, because to the extent that you tell people that mediation is about compromise, you're turning them flat off, because they have no interest in doing that at all. So put it on the collaborative side, and you have a much easier time selling mediation, since those of us who view it as being collaborative anyway, that's what we do. But sometimes people slip and use that word compromise, and it is a turn off.
And the only thing I was going to add is welcome to the Dispute Resolution Center, not-for-profit world.
Three opinions, no waiting.
No, but I mean, it's what you're, all I can say is normalize it for you. I mean, that's the reality. It's really, really hard. No, but I'm talking about you specifically in terms of a program. The center has been doing it now for 20 years, so now it has developed a reputation, and it's still a constant struggle. But we have enough programs. We could not survive without almost everything being court referred or program referred. So last year we did 2,600 cases. In terms of just off the street, people that we're able to pull in without being program referred, might be 10% of the cases. And that's it. And the problem, but it's a lot more work. Our case managers, will field 100 calls to get, 1 to 10 cases to the table. And actually, the adverse thing about when or someone's on the news or the article is all of a sudden that Monday or Tuesday we're inundated with hundreds of calls of every kind of nature, and very rarely does it actually result in mediation. I'm not saying not to do it because it's important, because you still have to get your name out there, and the call that will be important might come in 6 months later because they saw you on TV. It's just the reality, and you just have to keep doing it. It's legwork, and ultimately, and Andy, Rocky may have talked about this, it's reputation. And so the center now has developed a reputation. It surprises me every day that all the people that don't know about the center. Now we do very, very little active marketing because of our budget constraints, but we've been around for 20 years. And I think, did you mention that someone in the business told you how long it would take to develop your practice?
Oh yeah, no, I was told it would be 5 to 7 years, and that was coming out with 20 years of working in the field. And it was absolutely right. It took me 5 years before my practice was self-sustaining.
But ultimately, it's based on reputation, ultimately, and you just have to jumpstart.
I will add to that, though, and this might be a good end note to counteract my inherent cynicism. I will add, however, that we're now we're the people, you and us, are the people that are planting the seeds and working in the vineyards, and we're not seeing the harvest yet. But now you're seeing programs where kids in grammar school are being taught about conflict management, conflict resolution. In colleges, it's being in the programs and things. Another generation from now, I'm going to predict that we won't, I'm not going to say it's going to be a piece of cake, but we're not going to be having this conversation because people will be exposed to it much earlier than life. It'll be ingrained to them. It ought to be anyway, okay? But all the law schools have it in their curriculum now. The business schools are putting in their curriculum. The K-12s are putting in their curriculum. You won't have to come to it in the way that we came to it because we were either informed